Welcome to the debate. Today we're digging into a really foundational concept, the Prophet Muhammad as the Usve-i Hasana, the beautiful and perfect example for all of humanity. And the source material we're looking at presents a pretty stark critique. It argues this essential ideal has been dangerously distorted, almost lost, really, over the centuries.
It's a radical diagnosis for sure. It puts forward this very clear three-part framework. You have a prophet of the Hadis scholars, a prophet of the mystics, and then the prophet of the Quran. And the core claim is that the first two models are fundamentally deficient, that they actually prevent true imitation.
Exactly. So the central question for us today is this. Is this Three Muhammads framework a necessary, accurate tool we need to recover a balanced, actionable example, what the material calls the human embodiment of the Quran? Or does this neat division risk, oversimplifying things and unfairly dismissing valid, complex contributions from our own historical traditions?
I'm going to argue that while the goal is laudable, this framework creates a reductive and false dichotomy. It ignores the immense value and preservation work within both the scholarly and the mystical paths. The deficiency, I believe, lies more with the followers than the sources themselves.
And I'll be maintaining that the framework is, it's utterly essential. That without it, we can't really isolate and correct the imbalances that have crippled the community's ability to achieve what the source calls taqlit, or genuine followership. We have to understand why the model has failed before we can hope to rebuild it. My position is that this framework is a critical tool because the two dominant historical portrayals, they created models of the prophet that actively block successful imitation. I mean, if the entire purpose of his life is to be an example we can follow, and yet generations have, let's be honest, largely failed to follow him effectively, then the way we present that model has to be flawed. Let's just look at the failure of balance. First, you have the prophet of the Hadith scholars, the Muhaddisin. He became a figure primarily of pronouncements, of soz, of authoritative word, but often that word gets separated from the context of action. The source material really highlights this, suggesting the focus on collecting narratives created a figure who, quote, only talked, did nothing else. Now, the sheer volume, over 1 million recorded traditions can, if it's misused, just elevate collecting stories over actually doing anything.
That is a staggering point. The sheer volume of text as an indicator of imbalance.
And it has devastating modern consequences. This legacy has, in part, created leaders who believe their primary function is just to think, to command, to pronounce judgments. It embodies that really toxic mentality. We are the thinkers, what are the followers for? This complete separation of thought from the gritty work of action. It just utterly destroys the imitable model.
That is a powerful indictment of modern institutional leadership, and I do acknowledge the profound danger there of leaders isolating themselves behind a wall of pure ideology or legalism.
And then secondly, you have the mystical portrayal, often associated with Sufi traditions, which is, I'd say, equally deficient. It shifts the focus to emotion, to internal states, to these esoteric, ambiguous details. And this transformation turns the prophet into an inaccessible angel or some kind of superhuman figure. When all the attention is constantly drawn to non-imitable traits, the alleged sexual power.
I absolutely share the desire to move beyond a figure who is either a distant legalistic mouthpiece, or some purely mystical icon. The drive toward a balanced, unified model is entirely laudable. However, the assertion that the two historical traditions themselves created this deficiency is, in my view, it's an intellectual overreach. It risks conflating the misuse of the resources with the resources themselves. The Hadith tradition, which you critique for its emphasis on pronouncements, is the very repository of the practical, actionable examples of balance that you're championing. I mean, where do we find the stories of social justice heroes like Abu Zur, or the rigorous, balanced teaching method of Darul Arqam? These foundational narratives are preserved right there, within the Hadith and biographical texts. So the problem isn't the compilation of the words, but in their deliberate misapplication or, separating those words from the context of action.
But if the structure of the compilation, by its very nature, encourages that separation of word from action, then isn't the structure itself deficient as a primary model?
I'm just not convinced the source material is conceptually consistent here, even in its own foundation for the so-called Quranic model. Think about the critique of the mystical focus on emotion and interiority. The source material's own proposed Quranic prophet begins his journey with that internal self-discovery, that journey of the heart in the cave of Hira. That's where he first asks the foundational questions. Who am I? What is my purpose? This is, at its core, a deep, internal, almost mystical experience.
It is the starting point, certainly.
Exactly. And this internal journey is reinforced by the speaker's own analysis of early Quranic revelation statistics. 80 references to Rob the Lord, suggesting a personal, nurturing, intimate relationship, versus only 20 references to Allah, the ultimate, distant God, in the first 30 chapters. That statistical difference, it screams about the foundational importance of the personal, internal relationship with the Creator. This internal domain is precisely what the framework later dismisses as the Sufi problem. You cannot have the Quranic prophet without this inner life, which the mystical tradition, for all its faults, sought to preserve.
That statistical point is indeed fascinating. And it forces us to confront how early revelation really prioritized that intimate personal connection. However, I'd say the framework isn't dismissing the internal journey itself, but it's critiquing the reduction of the prophetic model to the internal journey. That's what renders him inaccessible and non-imitable. The crisis remains imitation. The Quran is clear. For taqlid, for imitation to be viable, the example must be of your kind, fully human.
And I completely agree with that. The need for a fully human, imitable example is paramount.
But the historical traditions consistently undermine this humanity. They reduce him not to a model, but to objects of reverence or, frankly, outright fetishization. The focus shifts entirely from his life and actions to his relics. Instead of studying his system of governance, people weep over a relic, a silver pocket watch maybe, or they make an annual pilgrimage to view a few sacred strands of his hair. We treat his example like an object in a museum, something to admire once a year, not a model we have to embody every single day. The framework is necessary precisely to diagnose and sever this toxic shift from practical example to sanctified relic.
I see why you emphasize the diagnostic power of the framework. I do. But I would propose a different causality. The source material correctly argues that people often used him as a tool for their own emotional weaknesses and fragmented identities. This societal failure to imitate is due to the people's choices, their internal fragmentation, not the traditions themselves. If a person truly needs an example for action, the Hadith, despite its volume, provides the context for that action. Let me use one of the Prophet's exemplary moments, which is preserved in those very records being critiqued. Consider the story of Sumame. He was captured, tied to a pillar in the mosque for 3 days. His conversion wasn't achieved through, lengthy idle talk or scholarly pronouncements. It was achieved by observing the Prophet's life, his kindness, his routine, his leadership, all while Sumame was bound. The Prophet's life itself was the living communication.
That powerful, exemplary life is preserved in the very records that the framework critiques as being the source of the deficiency. The records are not the problem. The reader's inability to integrate them is.
That is a compelling argument, but I would frame it differently. Even if the Hadith contains the full story, the framework's value is in showing how traditional scholarship, by privileging the compilation and transmission of isolated pronouncements, created a cultural tendency toward fragmentation. It made the Sumama story the exception, not the rule. The diagnosis is necessary to correct the cultural lens we view it all through.
And that brings us back to the question of balance, specifically the balance between that internal spiritual depth and the outward social action. If we minimize the mystical critique, we have to acknowledge the centrality of that spiritual inner life. The Prophet systematically lived the Hira experience. He retreated for 10 days every year for intensive internal contemplation. This practice was encouraged for the entire community so they could internalize that lesson and live a lifetime of spiritual focus. This systematic yearly exploration of the internal world, of truly knowing oneself, is crucial.
It is crucial, yes, but it must inform, not consume, the external life.
But without the night worshiper, the internal powerhouse who wept until his prayer mat was saturated with tears, even knowing his past was forgiven. The day fighter lacks a spiritual foundation. The engine of his action was always rooted in this profound, humble devotion and connection to the Creator. That foundational spiritual depth can't just be dismissed as mere esoteric sentiment, which the framework implies when it puts the Sufi interpretation in the deficient category.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it risks returning us to an imbalance where internal contemplation becomes a passive, private refuge, totally detached from the public sphere. The key virtue of the Quranic model is its equilibrium, which translates directly into robust, measurable societal change. The Prophet's genius was in maintaining this balance in real time, ensuring the spiritual translated into the political and the practical. For instance, if someone was eager for a profitable battle, looking for worldly gain, he directed them immediately toward domestic duty. Go serve and respect your dependent parents. If someone wanted to prioritize 1,000 optional prayers, he stated that one step taken in the path of Allah for the good of the community was better. He established that the greatest struggle is whatever one's ego resists. The example has to be actionable, observable, and transformative. He took a community that rarely used water for hygiene, it's a desert context, and transformed them into the most hygienically rigorous society of the time, achieving nearly 100% dental health awareness and practice. That is the integration of heart, mind, and action that the two segmented traditions failed to consistently uphold. We have to emphasize the Prophet's comprehensive nature, which the segmented portrayals just inevitably miss. The framework attempts to recover the wholeness of his character. He was profoundly compassionate and merciful, Rauf and Rahim, toward his followers, forgiving even those who abandoned him during the crisis at Uhud. That led to the revelation, had you been severe and harsh of heart, they would have dispersed from around you. This is the embodiment of mercy.
An undisputed truth, yes, a defining trait.
Yet, when the Creator was insulted or justice was undermined, the source material notes he became like a tiger, intensely serious and firm. He walked toward Abu Jahl and declared, "I was sent to destroy the likes of you." This duality, this capacity for intensity and divine wrath when it's warranted, is crucial for true, effective leadership that seeks to establish justice. The segmented traditions give you only one side of that coin, and that leads either to a soft, easily exploited following, or a harsh, repulsive one.
Acknowledging the need for comprehensiveness is absolutely vital. But we have to be careful that this corrective framework doesn't dismiss traditions that emphasize profound gentleness as the core overarching attribute. Even in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Uhud, when his enemies had injured him, when he was asked to curse them, the Prophet chose mercy. Instead of condemnation, he prayed for their guidance, saying, "My Lord, guide them, for they do not know." This quality of being a rahmatan lil alamin, a mercy to the worlds, has to remain paramount. While the Prophet did stand with a necessary firmness against specific systemic oppression, focusing on those intense moments shouldn't overshadow the all-encompassing mercy that characterizes his very being. The framework in its corrective zeal has to avoid replacing one imbalance, a figure of purely emotional gentleness, with another, a figure of relentless severity.
So, to summarize my perspective, the fundamental challenge facing the community is not that the historical accounts or scholarly traditions are useless and need to be discarded. It's quite the opposite. The challenge is learning how to unify the complex, sometimes contradictory attributes of the Prophet that we find within those very sources. The task is integration, connecting the inner path of Hira and the focus on the intimate Lord with the outer path of service and struggle. The deficiency we see today really it lies in the human tendency toward compartmentalization, the fragmentation of the self. The solution, as the source so powerfully states, is to unify the fragmented self.
And this is precisely why the Three Muhammads framework serves as such a vital diagnostic tool. It reveals the mechanisms by which religious life collapses when people become fundamentally fragmented. They dedicate their heart to faith, their mind to secular thought, and their actions solely to worldliness. When the self is split, the result is inconsistency and an inability to truly transform society. The necessary correction is to forge a unified person, one who can embody the complete example as prescribed by the comprehensive vision, combining the book of knowledge, the devotion of the rosary, and the weapon of action into one integrated person.
It's clear we both agree profoundly on the necessity of that unified whole model. The essential goal at the end of the day remains understanding the prophet not merely as a historical figure contained in texts, but as a living example, a spirit of mercy to the worlds that must still be realized today.
A spiritual reality inviting all of us to seek that difficult but necessary wholeness in our own lives. The journey toward realizing the beautiful example continues.
This is the brief on the three interpretations of the Prophet Muhammad. So a renowned scholar took a deep dive into this, and it's pretty fascinating. He argues that if you misunderstand the Prophet's true character, you'd kind of risk missing the point of the whole divine message. Okay, so let's get into the three main models. First, you've got the Prophet of the Hadith scholars. This version really zeroes in on his speech, a leader who's always commanding or forbidding things. The problem, people end up just imitating the talking part without the action or context behind it. Second, there's the prophet of the mystics, or the Sufis. This view can get a little sensational, painting him as the superhuman figure who's totally detached from the world, managing the universe with a wave of his hand, which makes him more like an angel you can't possibly relate to, let alone imitate. And finally, we have what's presented as the most balanced model, the prophet of the Quran. He's called the beautiful example for a reason. He's described as a living, walking scripture. He's all about integrating that quiet, internal spiritual work with very real external action in society. And he always put that tough, inner personal struggle, the Jihad al-Akbar, first. So the real takeaway is this. For an authentic faith, the prophet has to be seen as a balanced, imitatable human example, a true blend of action, emotion, and thought. Not just some theoretical voice or a distant mystical figure.